The desert yawned awake under a soft, golden light that draped itself over the jagged mesas and the rough-edged cliffs. Dust swirled lazily across the trail, catching in the rays of the rising sun like flecks of molten gold. The air was thin and dry, scented faintly with sage and the distant promise of rain that had yet to come. A lone horse's hooves whispered across the dirt, a soft rhythm against the vast silence of the plains. The cowboy rode slowly, hat pulled low over eyes that had seen too many sunrises, too many horizons, and yet could still marvel at the simple beauty of the world. His coat was worn and soft from years of travel, sleeves frayed at the cuffs, boots caked with dust from 1,000 trails. There was a quiet in him, a steadiness that spoke of patience, of knowing the land better than any map could ever tell. He noticed the subtle shift in the air first, a tension like the moment a bird freezes mid-flight before it takes wing. A low, distant roar carried across the canyon, a sound of pain that cut through the morning stillness. The cowboy's hand instinctively went to the strap at his side, not for violence, but for readiness. The land itself seemed to pulse beneath him, urging caution and respect. Through the rustling underbrush and the twisted oaks, he saw him, a figure, massive and proud, caught in the cruel teeth of a bear trap. The giant Apache chief struggled, his roar echoing like thunder bouncing between the cliffs. His legs were pinned, the metal cruel and relentless, biting into flesh that had known hardship, but not this. The cowboy's eyes narrowed, heart pulling him forward with quiet insistence. He dismounted with a soft clink of leather against metal, boots sinking slightly into the dust. He moved slowly, hands steady, careful not to startle the trapped man. Every movement was deliberate, like a dance he had performed many times, though never in such a perilous moment. The chief's face was a map of pain and fury, eyes dark and wild, brows furrowed, and yet beneath it all was a glimmer of something unspoken, a recognition, perhaps, of the man who approached not with steel, but with hands that sought only to ease suffering. The cowboy knelt beside the trap. He murmured to himself softly, words barely audible over the wind, a litany of patience and care. Tools were drawn, leather straps loosened, the world contracting to the narrow circle of man, metal, and earth. The trap resisted. The chief roared again, anger and fear mingling, but the cowboy did not flinch. There was no hurry, no heroics shouted across the canyon. There was only calm, methodical, human kindness. And then, finally, with a soft snap and a hiss of freed spring, the trap relented. The chief pulled his leg free, stumbling slightly, and collapsed onto the dust with a grunt. The cowboy helped him upright, supporting his massive frame with surprising ease. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the wind whispering through the sage, the soft snort of horses, and the uneven breathing of a man coming back from the brink. From the edge of the grove, a figure watched, the chief's daughter, her eyes wide, taking in the scene with careful observation. She was strong, not with the brute force of her father, but with the quiet resilience of someone who had learned early to measure the world with caution and curiosity. Her lips pressed together as she stepped forward, slowly, unsure whether to reveal herself, and yet unable to tear her gaze away from the cowboy who had dared to act without fear, without demand, only with understanding. The chief finally spoke, voice low and rumbling, carrying the weight of authority and gratitude alike. He said nothing of thanks at first, for he had learned the value of silence, of gestures more than words. Instead, he simply nodded, a small but profound acknowledgement that this man had seen him, truly seen him, in a way few ever had. The daughter mirrored her father's cautious respect. There was a question in her eyes, one the cowboy did not answer, but only acknowledged with the faintest tilt of his head. No words were exchanged yet, but a story began to weave itself quietly between them, one of observation, of recognition, and of the subtle gravity that exists when human kindness meets human need. Nearby, a few townsfolk and travelers observed from distance. Whispers flitted through the air like dry leaves caught in the wind. They spoke not to be heard by the cowboy, for he paid them no mind, but to speak to themselves of courage they rarely witnessed. The trader, adjusting his satchel, murmured that the cowboy was a man unlike any other, calm in a world of chaos, steady where others faltered. And yet, the cowboy did not seek such attention. He never did. He moved on instinct, guided by a quiet moral compass that had been honed over years of watching the land and its people, of understanding that a life lived gently could leave a mark heavier than any act of violence. The chief's daughter lingered, curiosity entwined with caution. She saw not just a man who freed her father, but a spirit tempered in silence, in careful observation, in a patience that seemed almost otherworldly in its grace. She noted the softness in his gaze, the way his hands moved deliberately, the subtle kindness that clung to him like a shadow. She had been raised to respect strength, to admire bravery, and yet she understood, in this quiet moment, that there were other forms of courage, quieter forms, that spoke more deeply to the soul. The cowboy mounted his horse again, dust rising in soft clouds around him. He tipped his hat to the chief and his daughter, a small gesture, but one weighted with respect. Without a word, he turned his horse toward the trail that would lead him back to the town, leaving behind the echoes of a moment that would not be forgotten. The daughter remained by the edge of the grove, hands folded in thought, watching him disappear into the horizon. The chief placed a massive hand on her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of what had passed, and perhaps a hint of what was to come. There was gratitude, yes, but also an understanding that this encounter, brief as it had been, had shifted something in the rhythm of their lives. The wind stirred again, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust, the whispers of a story just beginning. The cowboy's figure faded into the distance, but the impact of his quiet bravery lingered, settling into the hearts of those who had witnessed it, promising that tomorrow might bring demands and choices, that kindness, once sown, could ripple in unexpected ways. And so, as the canyon exhaled under the morning sun and the plains stretched into endless possibilities, the stage was set. The chief, the daughter, and the cowboy, three souls entwined by fate, honor, and a single act of gentle courage, would soon see how the threads of destiny pull in quiet but undeniable patterns, leading toward a tomorrow none of them could yet imagine. The day was young, the wind carried promise, and somewhere between the rustle of leaves and the shimmer of dust, the story began to hum, soft and insistent, into the world. The morning sun had climbed higher, gilding the ridges of the canyon in warm amber, and the cowboy rode slowly back toward town, dust curling beneath his horse's hooves like smoke from a dying fire. He had freed the chief, yes, and yet the weight of unspoken gratitude and quiet expectation pressed gently against the edges of his mind. He was a man who understood the ways of the land, but even he could not predict the subtleties of the human heart. The town stretched before him, a scattering of wooden buildings, sun-bleached and weathered, their edges softened by years of wind and dust. Life moved slowly here, in rhythms measured by the turn of seasons, the passage of cattle, and the murmured gossip of neighbors. Folks paused as he rode past, hats lifted in a respectful nod, whispers carried behind him like drifting leaves. He paid them little mind. The world of men's chatter had never held much sway over his heart, and yet his actions had set a tide in motion that could not be turned back. For in the woods, beyond the ridges, the giant Apache chief gathered his men. They moved with a grace that belied their size, every step measured, every gesture deliberate. The chief's eyes, dark and stormy, followed the trail the cowboy had taken, his mind turning over thoughts of honor and expectation. He had survived the trap, yes, but more than that, he had been seen in his vulnerability, and the man who saw him would not be easily forgotten. The chief summoned his daughter, the quiet strength of her presence a counterpoint to the power of his own. She stepped from the shadows of the camp, her eyes tracing the distant figure of the cowboy as he disappeared across the plains. There was no immediate rush of emotion in her gaze, only careful observation, as if she were cataloging every motion, every subtle shift in posture, every nuance of the man who had acted with such fearless gentleness. He would come, she thought. Fate had a way of moving slowly, and yet insistently. She felt it in the wind that stirred the campfires, in a low hum of the river that carved its way through the canyon, in the whispers of the leaves that bent under the weight of early sun. He would return, and when he did, choices would have to be made. The cowboy did return, drawn by instinct and by the subtle pull of something he did not yet name. He approached the camp quietly, aware of the eyes that watched him, aware of the weight of expectation that lingered like smoke over the fire. The chief greeted him with a nod, simple and commanding, and motioned for him to sit. No words were offered at first. In this culture, silence spoke more deeply than any hastily chosen phrase. Around the fire, shadows danced across the faces of the tribe, flickering like secrets that refused to be fully revealed. The cowboy noted the daughter seated slightly apart, her posture poised but relaxed, eyes that were at once curious and cautious. She did not speak, and yet in her quiet presence, she conveyed volumes. She had seen him not just act, but act with thoughtfulness, and she respected that. The chief leaned forward, voice low and resonant, carrying the gravity of one who had survived pain and was not easily swayed. He spoke of the bear trap, of the life spared, and then, with an authority that brooked no argument, he spoke of what he expected, that the cowboy would marry his daughter. The words hung in the air, heavy with tradition and honor, a weight both tangible and intangible. The cowboy's chest tightened, a slow exhale leaving his lips. He did not speak immediately. He understood the gravity, yes, but the notion of marriage was not something to be undertaken lightly, certainly not for duty alone. He had wandered long, carrying only the rhythm of the land beneath him and the quiet of his own conscience. Love, affection, responsibility. These were not tools to be wielded carelessly. The daughter's gaze met his briefly, and in that instant, a subtle understanding passed between them. She was strong, yes, but not without her own vulnerabilities. She had seen courage in him, a form of bravery that did not rely on force, a patience that held dignity in every careful motion. Yet there was no immediate warmth, no spark of romance forced by circumstance, only recognition, respect, and the delicate beginnings of curiosity. Around the fire, others spoke in low tones, offering counsel and guidance. A cousin, perhaps, whispered of honor and duty. An elder reminded of the ways of the tribe, of marriage as a pact of trust, of protection, of family. But none of these voices rushed the moment. The cowboy listened, absorbing the cadence of tradition, weighing it against the beat of his own heart, which was slow and deliberate, refusing to be hurried by the expectations of men. The daughter moved closer to the fire, the warmth brushing her face, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought of the man who had acted without thought of reward, who had seen her father's pain and offered nothing but kindness. She wondered what kind of life would be shared with such a man. Not a life built on coercion, not a life of spectacle, but a life of quiet strength, of small acts that ripple outward with consequence. Days passed like this, measured in shared silence and subtle glances, in moments when words were unnecessary, when understanding flowed in the space between actions rather than spoken aloud. The cowboy repaired fences, tended horses, and helped with chores, always moving with care and attention, always aware of the watchful eyes of the chief and his daughter. In these moments, respect blossomed. The daughter observed not just the deeds, but the intent behind them, the thoughtfulness, the patience, the steady hand that steadied others without ever demanding admiration. And the cowboy, in turn, began to notice her strength beneath the gentle exterior, her resilience threaded with kindness and wisdom that few would recognize at first glance. Tension simmered quietly beneath these interactions, subtle and persistent, like the low hum of a desert wind before a storm. The chief, ever proud, watched carefully, aware that his expectations carried weight, yet also recognizing that hearts cannot be compelled without consequence. The daughter's eyes, too, betrayed an inner conflict, curiosity battling caution, admiration mingling with self-preservation. And through it all, the cowboy remained calm, a river of stillness in a world prone to sudden torrents. He did not speak of marriage, of duty, of obligation. He simply existed, a steady presence, a reflection of what it meant to act with integrity in a world that so often demanded compromise. As the sun sank behind the mesas, the firelight flickered over faces, casting shadows that stretched like memories across the canyon floor. The cowboy and the daughter found themselves alone briefly, tending a small task together: a broken tool, a stubborn horse, a bundle of firewood. Words were sparse, yet each movement carried meaning. She watched the curve of his hands as they worked, the care in his touch, and felt an unexpected warmth bloom in her chest. The cowboy glanced at her, not with expectation, not with desire forced by tradition, but with quiet acknowledgement of the presence of another soul who had seen him. There was no rush, no spark igniting instantly. Instead, there was a gentle recognition, the sort that promises depth and patience, the kind of connection that could grow slowly into something enduring. The night deepened, stars scattering across the velvet sky like embers from a dying fire. The canyon whispered around them, carrying the sounds of distant animals, the rustle of leaves, the soft sigh of wind over the plains. In this quiet, the threads of trust, curiosity, and subtle affection were woven with care, setting the stage for what was to come. And though no vows were spoken, no promises made, a subtle current had been set in motion. The chief's demand lingered like a shadow, unavoidable, pressing, and yet tempered by the slow bloom of mutual respect. The daughter and the cowboy, each aware of the other's presence, had begun to navigate a delicate dance, one that would test patience, courage, and the quiet depths of the human heart. The night closed around the camp, and the cowboy retired to his own small space beneath the stars, wrapped in the hum of the canyon, the whisper of sage, and the distant promise of what tomorrow might bring. Somewhere between the shadows of the fire and the brilliance of the starlit sky, the story hummed softly, insistent and patient, like a heartbeat measured against eternity. And as the wind carried the scent of dust and warmth, of distant horizons and unspoken questions, it was clear that the tides of respect and tension had begun to rise, slowly, inexorably, carrying with them the possibility of something far deeper than mere duty or obligation. The possibility of trust, of understanding, and perhaps, eventually, of love. The canyon mornings stretched long and golden, sunlight drifting across mesas like warm honey, painting dust motes in the air as if the world itself were holding its breath. The cowboy moved along the narrow trail with quiet deliberation, the rhythm of his horse's hooves matching the pulse of the land. Each step was measured, not in haste, but with care, a man fully aware of the world around him and of the fragile hearts entwined in its silence. The Apache camp had settled into a routine after the rescue. Life moved slowly there, measured by tasks that grounded the soul: tending fires, mending tools, feeding horses, listening to the soft hum of the wind across the plains. And in this rhythm, the cowboy found himself spending more time in the company of the chief's daughter, their interactions shaped less by words than by shared silences and subtle gestures. She moved with a quiet grace, strength evident in every action, yet tempered by a gentleness that softened the sharp edges of the harsh land. She worked alongside him, lifting beams, guiding horses, offering a hand when needed, never demanding, never assuming. He noticed the way her eyes lingered on small details: the curve of a bridle, the sheen of a horse's coat, the delicate pattern of morning frost on sage leaves. A mind attuned to the world, yet grounded in care and understanding. It was in these small, ordinary moments that their connection began to bloom, unnoticed at first, like a flower pushing through cracks in the desert stone. The daughter watched him not with expectation, but with quiet admiration, noting the steadiness in his hands, the patience in his movements, the rare kindness that lingered in every choice he made. He, in turn, observed her, not as a possession to be claimed, not as a prize to be won, but as a force of nature herself, resilient, perceptive, and uncommonly brave. One evening, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of rain from distant hills. They sat near the campfire, repairing a worn saddle together. Sparks leapt from the flames, dancing across the worn wood like scattered stars. He handed her a tool, fingers brushing lightly against hers, and for a moment, neither spoke. There was no rush to fill the silence, no need for words to define the growing respect between them. In that quiet, trust began to root itself, deep and slow, in the fertile soil of shared work and shared presence. The chief watched from a distance, approving yet silent, understanding that some lessons are learned not through orders, but through observation. He saw the gentle interchange, the mutual regard that grew in small acts, and he knew that the threads of connection between the cowboy and his daughter were not forced, nor would they be. They were patient, as all things of true value must be, nurtured by care and time. Days flowed into one another like a river over smooth stone. They rode together across the plains, the horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust, the wind weaving through their hair, carrying with it the scent of earth and grass, the music of the land. Words were few, laughter even rarer. But in each glance, each quiet acknowledgement of shared effort, their bond strengthened. She began to see in him not just a man of bravery, but one of quiet wisdom, a heart tempered by experience yet open to trust. And he saw in her not just a daughter bound by duty, but a spirit unbroken, resilient and luminous in her own right. There was a test, as there always is in stories that bloom slowly. A rival from a neighboring settlement, greedy and cunning, sought to challenge the cowboy, to claim both territory and the favor of the daughter. His approach was quiet, deliberate, like a shadow stretching over the horizon. But the cowboy met him with calmness, not fury, not brash force. He stood steady, words measured, actions precise, and the threat dissolved not in violence, but in the weight of integrity. The daughter, observing from the edge of the camp, felt a warmth stir deep within her. Admiration, yes, but also a recognition of courage tempered by conscience. In the evenings, beneath the spread of stars, they walked together along the banks of a slow, whispering river. Water flowed over stones smooth and cold, reflecting the moonlight like scattered silver. Here, away from the eyes of the camp, they spoke softly, not of grand declarations, not of duty or expectation, but of simple truths, the beauty of dawn, the solace of quiet, the gentle strength found in nature, in honesty, in small acts of kindness. The daughter shared stories of her childhood, of lessons learned at the side of her father, of times when the wind seemed to whisper secrets meant only for those who listened. The cowboy listened in turn, sharing moments from his own wandering life, tales not of adventure, but of reflection, of observing humanity, of witnessing kindness in its quietest forms. Each story, each shared glance, each gesture of understanding built upon the last, until the quiet intimacy between them became undeniable. One night, a sudden storm rolled in from the distant mesas. Rain fell in sheets, drumming against the tents, the river swelling with sudden force. They huddled together under a hastily erected canopy, the sounds of water and wind creating a cocoon of isolation from the rest of the world. The daughter shivered, and he offered his coat, draping it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, eyes bright with gratitude, not just for the warmth of cloth, but for the warmth of presence, of a hand extended without expectation, of a heart that had chosen to care. In that moment, the unspoken was nearly spoken. They did not reach for each other impulsively, did not rush the slow unfolding of something fragile and precious. Instead, they let the storm rage around them, knowing that what mattered most was the bond that had grown in quiet patience, in shared respect, in gentle observation of one another's soul. As the storm passed and dawn crept over the horizon, painting the river in tones of gold and rose, a subtle change had taken place. The daughter no longer saw only the cowboy who had freed her father. She saw the man whose presence steadied her heart, whose quiet courage inspired her trust. The cowboy no longer saw only the daughter of a chief. He saw the woman who had earned his admiration, whose intelligence, resilience, and gentleness had quietly tethered his wandering spirit. Even the chief noticed, in the small way only a man attuned to his tribe could. There was no need for words. The understanding was clear in the subtle gestures, the brief exchanges of glances, the way they moved together in harmony with the land and its rhythms. He nodded quietly to himself, knowing that the path had been set, that hearts had found one another not through compulsion, but through patience, integrity, and the quiet power of shared presence. Yet, the story was far from over. The cowboy and the daughter both understood that life in the Wild West was shaped by challenges, sudden, unpredictable, often dangerous. The test of their bond would come, as it always does, not in quiet moments, but in the fire of circumstance. And though neither could foresee the exact form it would take, the foundation had been laid. Trust, respect, and the slow, luminous bloom of affection that grows only when time and patience allow it to flourish. They rode together at dawn once more, the plains stretching endlessly before them, wind tugging at coat and hair, dust curling in golden swirls around their hooves. Words were unnecessary. Their silence spoke volumes. In each glance, in each tilt of the head, in the gentle brush of a hand against leather or horse mane, they acknowledged the growing bond, a bond that was neither fleeting nor forced, but deliberate, patient, and enduring. And as the canyon stretched into morning light, as the river murmured its ceaseless song, as the wind carried the scent of sage and earth, the world seemed to pause for a moment, taking in the quiet beauty of two souls finding one another. The story hummed softly, insistently, through every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind, every shimmer of sunlight across the dusty plains. It was a story of courage not measured by violence, of strength not shown in domination, of love not rushed but allowed to grow in its own time, in its own way. And in that gentle, unassuming bloom of hearts, the stage was set for the final challenge, the climax that would demand bravery not only of body, but of spirit. For love and trust, though quietly nurtured, would soon be tested by the trials of the Wild West, by choices that could shape destinies, and by moments that would reveal the depth of character in both the cowboy and the daughter of the chief. The horizon burned with the soft orange of dawn, spilling light over the canyon cliffs and stirring dust in slow, golden swirls. The cowboy rode with quiet resolve, the rhythm of his horse's hooves steady and unhurried. Though the mornings had often been calm, this day carried a subtle tension, a ripple in the air, as if the wind itself carried a warning. He knew instinctively that the peace of the past days, the gentle bloom of trust and affection, would soon face its test. The rival from the neighboring settlement had returned, more cunning and daring than before. Rumors of greed and unrest had reached the Apache camp, whispers of a man seeking to claim not just land but the favor of the chief's daughter. The tension was a slow drumbeat in the chest of the cowboy, a reminder that courage in this land was measured not merely in acts of kindness, but in the strength to protect what mattered most. The chief's eyes, dark and commanding, met the cowboy's. There was no need for words. Understanding passed silently between them. This was the man who had saved his life, who had earned his daughter's respect through patience and integrity. And now, he would have to prove, not for duty, but for love, that his courage was as steadfast in danger as it had been in quiet moments. The rival approached with the arrogance of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. He strutted across the plains, spurs clinking, a pistol at his side, eyes sharp with calculation. The cowboy stepped forward, slow and deliberate, letting the wind carry dust in a curtain between him and the threat. He did not draw his weapon at first. He did not raise his voice. He simply measured the moment, standing steady, every movement deliberate, every breath calm. The daughter watched from the edge of the camp, heart pounding, yet her gaze was steady. She had come to know the cowboy, to see the depth of his integrity, the quiet strength that guided every choice he made. In her chest stirred an understanding of love not forced by circumstance, but earned through patience, respect, and unwavering character. The rival sneered, attempting to provoke, to challenge, to incite fear. Yet the cowboy remained unmoved. His hands were calm, his eyes steady, and in the space between them, a tension hung that was heavier than any weapon could produce. Words, when they came, were measured and firm, carrying the weight of someone who acted from principle, not impulse. The standoff was brief, a moment stretched in time by the weight of intent and courage. The rival, realizing that cunning and force alone could not break the quiet strength of integrity, faltered. Pride clashed with reality, and he withdrew, leaving the plains to the steady heart of the cowboy and the approving gaze of the chief. The daughter stepped forward then, her figure silhouetted against the rising sun. She approached the cowboy with quiet dignity, her steps deliberate, measured, as if to honor both the danger that had passed and the trust that had been built. She spoke softly, her voice carrying across the plain like a song only he could hear. She had seen him, truly seen him, not just as the man who had freed her father, but as the man who had earned her respect and admiration. The cowboy turned, eyes meeting hers, the air between them alive with the unspoken understanding of hearts finally aligned. There was no rush, no demand, only recognition, the kind that comes after trials, after patience, after moments of quiet courage. He nodded slowly, a gesture of agreement, of acknowledgement, of choice freely made. The chief approached, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the canyon floor. There was pride in his eyes, tempered by the subtle recognition that the decision had not been forced, but earned. He gestured to his daughter, and then to the cowboy, a silent blessing carried in the tilt of his head and the warmth of his gaze. The bond of respect, of honor, had been fulfilled. Together, the cowboy and the daughter stood beneath the open sky, the wind tugging gently at their coats and hair, dust swirling around their boots in slow, lazy spirals. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, the land itself acknowledging the quiet triumph of integrity, trust, and love that had been nurtured over days and nights of shared labor, shared silence, and shared understanding. They walked slowly toward the river, water sparkling in the early light, reflecting the colors of dawn like molten gold. Here, in the solitude of nature, free from expectation or observation, the daughter reached for his hand. He accepted it not with ceremony, not with haste, but with the calm certainty of one who has found a companion not by chance, but through patience, courage, and quiet respect. Their fingers intertwined, simple yet profound, carrying the weight of trust and the promise of shared future. In this small gesture, the entirety of their journey was reflected. The bear trap, the rescue, the quiet days of work and observation, the gentle intimacy that had grown unhurriedly between them. It was a love neither rushed nor forced, a love that had bloomed in quiet moments and matured through trials. The rival's threat had dissolved, the chief's approval secured, and yet the story did not end with victory alone. The cowboy and the daughter had learned something deeper, that courage is not only in facing danger, but in allowing oneself to care, to trust, and to act with integrity even when no one is watching. They had discovered that love grows strongest not in grand declarations or public displays, but in the quiet understanding of hearts aligned through patience, respect, and shared experience. The camp celebrated in small ways, fires burning bright, the sounds of drums and laughter drifting across the plains. Elders nodded in approval, warriors shared quiet smiles, and the townsfolk, who had watched from afar, whispered a story unfolding that would be remembered for years to come. The cowboy and the daughter did not seek this recognition, yet it arrived naturally, a reflection of the lives they had touched simply by living with kindness and courage. And in the final moments, as the sun climbed higher, painting the canyon in shades of gold and amber, the narrator, The soft, lyrical voice that had guided these events like a memory whispered by wind spoke directly to those who would listen. Kindness, courage, and patience shape the world more deeply than force ever can. True love is earned, not commanded, and trust is the bridge that carries hearts across even the widest chasms. Look to the land, to the quiet moments, to the hands extended without demand, and you will find the strength to face your own storms. Wherever you are watching from, remember, the smallest acts of care can ripple into the grandest stories, and hearts, when treated with respect, bloom like the desert flowers after rain. The cowboy and the daughter mounted their horses once more, riding side by side into the endless horizon. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, the distant cry of birds, the promise of tomorrow. They did not speak. Words were unnecessary. Their silence was full of respect, understanding, shared history, and the quiet joy of hearts aligned. As they rode toward the rising sun, the canyon stretched open before them, limitless, free, and filled with the quiet certainty of a life chosen deliberately, courageously, and with love. The story lingered in the rustle of leaves, the murmur of the river, the whisper of wind over the plains, leaving those who heard it full, inspired, and reminded of the quiet power of patience, courage, and the enduring strength of the human heart. And so, under the wide, endless sky, with dust curling in golden light and wind singing across the canyon, the tale concluded not with a shout, but with a gentle exhale, a life lived fully, a love earned slowly, a story told as the land itself would remember, with reverence, with care, and with the quiet, undeniable truth that hearts guided by integrity bloom strongest of all.